Okay. Oy vey. Oy vey is actually the sermon. So it's a good way to start, not knowing exactly where to start. Vayehi BeShallah paro et ha'am. And it was when Pharaoh sent the people, let the people go. V'lo nacham Elohim derech eretz Flishtim ki karov hu ki amar Elohim pen yinachem ha'am birotam milchama v'shavu mitzrayma. And it was when Pharaoh sent the people out, God did not lead them by the way of the Philistines because it was close, because God said, in case the people will be dissuaded when they see war, and then they'll go back to Egypt. And so God turned the people by the way of the wilderness of the Red Sea. And we learned today again what happens there. So this verse, this first verse of Parashat BeShallah, is interesting because the Parsha is not named after the first word, Vayehi. It's named after the second word, BeShallah, when Pharaoh sent. But it is the first word, Vayehi, that presents the most interesting of interpretations. Because, and I'm going to quote my teacher here, Rabbi Dr. Aryeh Cohn, he said the word Vayehi brings in this seductive punniness for the rabbis of antiquity. A seductive punniness is a pun or a potential pun that is so seductive that no matter how far-fetched it may sound, it has to be said. And so, Vayehi, the rabbis read alliteratively as vai, oi. And I mean, when I say the rabbis, I mean the rabbis of antiquity. 1,800 years ago, we're reading this verse as vai, oi, BeShallah. Seductive punniness. That's what my teacher, Dr. Cohn, called it. There's no reason to reread the word and it was Vayehi as oi, vai, BeShallah, unless you can't help yourself but read the verse that way. And then once you read the verse that way, you have to ascribe the word why, vai, oi, which is how they're reading it, to somebody in the story. And so in a compilation of Midrash called Tanhuma, named after the rabbi, there is a thread of Midrashim, of interpretations, that try to understand who it is that screamed out, vai, why, as the Israelites were being sent out of Egypt. So I'm going to give you a couple examples. One of them is, and each Midrash starts off the same way, Mikara vai, who yelled out, vai, why, oi, paro karavai. One interpretation is that Pharaoh, as Pharaoh was sending out the Israelites, cried out, why? Like, why am I doing this? And the way in which the rabbis understand that is that in the moment Pharaoh sending the Israelites out, he's saying to himself, oh, yeah, I had them. They were made me clay and bricks, and I didn't really get that they were a people, that they were capable of anything more. But as soon as they left Egypt, when they went and became troops by the sea because they were chumashim, they were armed, Pharaoh went out and saw how the very ones that had been making for him clay and bricks, the ones he tried to divide, had come together as an army that could go against him. And in that moment, he realized, oh no, vai BeShallah, why did I send them out? That's what the Midrash reads. Here's another one. Mi kara vai, who yells out why? The Egyptians are the ones who are yelling out why. Why are you doing this? Here's what the rabbis explain through this Vayehi vai oi vei. To what is the matter comparable to a physician who is in the district Now, when someone was injured, the physician healed him or her. When someone became sick, the physician healed him or her. As soon as the physician left the town, the people of the town cried out, "Why? Why? What will we do? Who will save us?" So it was when Israel left Egypt, the Midrash states. When the plague came over Egypt, they would come to Moses and seek help from him. If you remember, the only one who could stop the plagues was the one who could start the plagues. Moses became, in many sense, not only a liberator of Israelites from Egypt, he became a healer of Egyptians, and they were now watching their healer go out, BeShallah paro et ha'am. And so the Israelites yelled out, "Vai, oy vey, BeShallah paro et ha'am." Why is Pharaoh sending the people out? We are losing our healer. The Egyptians were anxious and scared at the loss of the Israelites from their society. Pharaoh became scared at the loss of his own power, even potentially his life, at the sight of the Israelites that he himself was sending out. Who else could it have been? Mikaravai Haknanim, the Canaanites, one Midrash says. How do we know this? While Israel was in Egypt, the Canaanites dwelt in and took care of the land of Israel. Remember, there were people there. They also ate of its fruits. As soon as they heard that Israel had left Egypt, they started screaming out, "Oy vey! Why? Why is Pharaoh sending out the Israelites?" Our lives are about to change drastically. Anxiety. Maybe it was Moses. Maybe it was Moses. And so one Midrash imagines that Moses is yelling out, "Why? Why are you sending them out? Remember, this is the Moses who took them out. Why are you sending them out? The whole point of this mission is to get to the land of Israel, and I'm not going to be able to go with them." Moses is sad, according to this thread of Midrash. And the last one is Mikaravai, who cried out. God cried out. Why? Now, this one is probably the most subversive because God is, in at least the way we tell the story, pulling the strings, as it were, for each and every action of the story. So what could God have been upset about such that God would yell out, "Vayahi oy"? Why? Well, the rabbis want us to understand it like this. Mashal lemelech shehayalo soneh. Imagine a ruler who has in the kingdom somebody that she really doesn't like. An enemy. Ma'asa hamalka. What would the ruler do? Natan artza biada kedei levakesh aleha alila. Basically, the rabbis want us to imagine that I find my enemy and I keep giving them a piece of my land to tend to. I say, "Here, tend to this." And then I ensure that they can't do a very good job so that I can come in and punish them and take it away over and over again. And there's this cycle that the rabbis imagine, the cycle of the plagues of God beating up on the Egyptians, such that when the story is about to end and the Egyptians are going to be taken out of our window and put in the rearview mirror, God's self is upset because God had grown accustomed to using the Egyptians as a punching bag. "Why are you sending them out, Pharaoh?" "I was having fun with this little game we were playing." You know, the only, in all of the Midrashim I found that decided to make a word play out of Vayahi into Oy vey, the only group that didn't say Vai, the Israelites, the actual slaves, which of course is another subversive read because in the story itself, everybody is happy about the Exodus except who? The Israelites. They're the ones who consistently ask to go back. But in the rabbinic imagination, it's just the opposite. Everybody else in the story is addicted to the status quo, such that they would allow slavery to continue. They're even sad about it, including God. God's self got addicted to his status quo, God's status quo, except for the Israelites, the ones who were liberated, the ones who could find no reason to lament seeing a slice of freedom, the ones redeemed, the ones who were finally given a future shaped differently than their past. Everyone has grown used to the arrangement in Egypt, this status quo, and each person for her own reason, because there's always a justification for the status quo, a manipulation of reality that serves nothing but the way it is and not the way it could be. And who suffers almost every time underneath the weight of a status quo? The most vulnerable. It's always the most vulnerable. The widow, the stranger, the orphan, the disabled, the lonely, the abandoned, the minority. Brian Stevenson said, I think when you see the status quo, when you see that it creates pain and anguish and suffering, what I am most afraid of is that things will stay the same. I recently learned a new word. It's called injunctification. Injunctification is the motivated tendency to construe the current status quo as the most desirable and reasonable state of affairs, the most representative of how things should be. I found this in an article that was written in 2009 by a group of scholars at the University of Waterloo called Inequality, Discrimination, and the Power of the Status Quo. Direct evidence for a motivation to see the way things are as the way they should be, which is to say, we have studied the addiction to the status quo as it pertains to inequality, discrimination, and power. Injunctification is the motivated desire to see the status quo as the way things ought to be. And according to the justification theory, or the injunctification theory, because it is a way of justifying the way things are, people are motivated to defend and legitimize the systems in which they operate. That is, the rules and socio-political institutions within which people function. Such a tendency, it has been suggested, is an adaptive, natural, psychological response instigated to reduce sources of threat and anxiety. Think back to why Pharaoh might have been upset at his own actions of sending them out, his own fear, the loss of his power, the threat of the Israelites, God, the loss of God's status quo, the Canaanites, the loss of their status quo, an adaptive, natural, psychological response to try and retain what is, to avoid the change that is coming. There is a safety in the status quo. There is not a lot of safety in drastic change. And that the rabbis picked up on in the Midrashim through every character in the story, except those being redeemed. There's an article in the Times this week by Roy Scranton. This is what he said: as the pandemic wore on, the desire to get back to normal has increased, and I worry that the hope for radical positive change has subsided. He is talking about climate, the environment. But we must not let it dissipate. We can't afford to, because we won't see normal again in our lifetimes. Our parents and grandparents burned normal up in their American-built cars with their American lifestyles, their American refrigerators, and American dreams. And now China and India are doing it too. And we sold it wherever we could. More than 3/4 of all industrial CO2 emissions have occurred since 1945, and more than half since 1988, since we knew what global warming was and what danger it posed. Now, as a new administration takes office and we look ahead to life after both COVID and Donald Trump, we need to face the fact that the world we live in is changing into something else, and that coping with the consequences of global warming demands immediate, widespread, radical action. None of this will matter, though, if our preparations don't include imagining a new way of life beyond this one. Not a new normal, not a return to the status quo, but a new ethos adapted in the chaotic world we've created. Going backwards with the climate is stepping back into a flood, a mabul, which will, as it has been, wash away our world. But it is not always global. The status quo and our being lured towards it exists in our neighborhoods as well. Recently, our affordable housing team, along with other synagogues and churches in Ward 3, held a research action, a meeting in which we brought in developers and advocates to ask them about what it would take to increase density here in Ward 3 such that we could require there be more affordable units in our neighborhood. We learned from developers and advocates together what we knew, but oftentimes we don't want to face. The biggest obstacle to new develop, especially when it comes to density in urban areas, the biggest obstacle, progressives who fight tooth and nail to keep their communities as they are. This might sting a little bit. It stung me. Those most likely to put signs on their lawn for the most progressive of causes are also very likely to be the ones in community meetings saying no more development, no more people in, under euphemisms usually like property value, sightlines, congestions, class sizes. Those euphemisms have been historically used and have also been proven to be signs of one particular fear, a fear of change, a fear that is a change in color of who people's neighbors will be in particular areas. The status quo in our neighborhoods is resisting the fact that our neighborhoods need to change. It already happens dynamically. They need to change. We need more density. We need more affordable units so that everybody has a chance to live in any neighborhood. And we can't be the ones who step in the way of what that looks like. And we have decided here in this community to be the ones who provoke more change and faster. Lastly, this past week, there was a court case in Israel, the state of Israel versus Yosef Kibita, where the interior ministry of our homeland, Eretz HaKodesh, submitted its concluding arguments to the court, contending that the conversion abroad of an individual, the conversion to Judaism abroad of an individual, is only valid if it takes place in a recognized Jewish community. Now, this is important because Yosef Kibita is of the Abu Yadaya in Uganda, a Jewish community that for generations has been living Jewishly and of recent, in the last 20 years, converted together under the auspices of my rabbi, Brad Artson, when he went to Uganda with other colleagues and helped to halachically, legally convert the community. And they have been living as conservative Jews since then with their leader, Rabbi Gershom Suzumu, who I will tell you, because I was his dean when he was a rabbinical student, my name is on his ordination certificate. And the Interior Ministry has made the case that his conversion and all of those conversions are valid only if they are in a recognized Jewish community for which the Abu Yadaya is not recognized because they were converted by us, but again, we're probably looking at more euphemisms here. And what that means for this community is that none of them have the right of return. They may not make Aliyah to Israel as citizens without going through another conversion that could be officially recognized. Let me tell you something about that community in Uganda. It is as recognized a Jewish community as this one right here. There is not one person in Washington, D.C. who is a member of Addis Israel or not a member who can claim to be a more recognizable Jewish community than the Abu Yadaya in Uganda. And I know this because I know their rabbi. Sorry, I'm yelling. It's a little bit personal. But the allure to the status quo of who has power to define who is a Jew in Israel, it's strong. And so we manipulate the story, we change the facts in order to keep the status quo so we can retain our power over who we think we ought to be or who we want to be in the world. But upending the normal, the status quo, is exactly what the Exodus story, it's exactly what the Exodus story puts in front of us as a path to a redemptive change. God led the Israelites, v'lo nacham Elohim derech eretz plishtim. God did not lead them by way of the Philistines, ki karovhu, because it was too close. Well, the rabbis reread that verse too, and instead of saying God didn't run them by the Philistines because they'd be scared, there'd be another war, they'd have to go back, what the rabbis say is that God did not redeem the people Israel with derech eretz, in the way of the world, in the way the rest of the world works. You see, the rest of the world works, according to the rabbis, where the servant carries the master, where the servant washes the master, where the servant dresses the master, where the servant supports the master. But in our story, in the Torah story, it is precisely the opposite. Derech Eretz, the way of the world, is being flipped around from those in power looking for other people to serve them to God, the most powerful there is, serving the most vulnerable. It is God who lights the path up by day and by night for the Israelites. It is not the other way around. God begins our story, the one with us, the ex-slaves, by serving us. So too, any status quo is upended by power coming around and seeing itself as the ones who serve, not the ones who are served. The power to resist change is a dominant force in this world. And if we need this reminder, a new president can't change that, sadly. The status quo is far too powerful. But if each of us can channel our divine source of love, that courage, and we can nudge it along, maybe, just maybe, we can be able to flip the story to Parashat BeShallah, where the why turns into a how. Maybe, just maybe. That I think we can do together. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
Continue with Musaf on page 100.